Robert Bob Faurot was the youngest of Mr. and Mrs. Frederick W. Faurot's 8 children. The family moved from Columbia to Mountain Grove, Missouri in 1918 and stayed there until Bob's senior year of high school. Bob's close-knit, loving family turned their home into a favorite gathering place for friends and family. Bob's father was a tireless coach, and some kind of pickup game was always happening at the house after the day's work was done. After high school, Bob attended the University of Missouri, where he played blocking back and kicker for the Mizzou Tigers. During college, Bob broke the school record for the longest punt in 1937 with a kick of 72 yards, and that record held into the 1960s. In addition to football, Bob was captain of the baseball team, played basketball, and won a crown for the boxing team. Bob was also a member of the Sigma Chi social fraternity. At university, Bob met Helen Stegall. They fell in love and hoped to marry after Bob was out of the service in 1943. In March 1940, during his senior year, Bob joined the Army Air Corps. He was sent to Tulsa, Oklahoma for his primary training at Spartan Aircraft, which was a civilian contractor for pilots of the U.S. Army. While at Spartan, Bob trained on old PT-3s and later on newer PT-13s, one of which we have here at the museum. Most of those at Spartan were scared that they would wash out, as only about 50% of those attending the school passed the 9-week program. Those that passed, including Bob, took a short leave and were then sent to Randolph Field in San Antonio for basic flight training. Randolph Field, often called the West Point of the Air Corps, was where incoming pilots received further military and ground training, as well as flight training in more advanced aircraft, such as the BT-13 and the AT-6. After training at Randolph, Bob was sent to advanced flight training at Kelly Field in San Antonio. Pilot Frank Royal remembers,
"The men graduating from Spartan were told that they were among the top 10% of American males. They loved to believe it, getting more self-confident and cocky every day."
At Kelly Field, the pilots continued to fly more advanced planes, such as the BC-1A and the BT-9, as well as flying night training missions in AT-6s. In addition to flying training missions, the pilots trained in supervising the maintenance of their own aircraft, gunnery practice, formation flying, instrument flying, navigation, flying at altitude, and combat flying, more commonly known as dogfighting. After Kelly, the men graduated as commissioned second lieutenant in the Army Air Corps Reserve. Bob graduated with the Class 40G, which was divided into 3 squadrons, the 39th, the 40th, and the 41st. The men were permitted to preference their initial assignment, and Bob, along with about 19 others, chose the 39th at Selfridge Field, Michigan. Selfridge was said to be the base for the best fighter pilots in the Air Corps, and the men sent there filled the newly formed 31st Pursuit Group. After flight school, Lieutenant Faurot was chosen as one of 3 volunteer American Air officers to fly as observers with the RAF in England. In England, Robert flew Spitfire and Hurricane fighters with the Polish RAF squadron in the Battle of Britain. Because of their service, the men that flew with the RAF were awarded the Polish Combat Medal by the Polish government exiled in England at the time. After 2 months in Europe, the men came back to the States in July 1941 and traveled to New York. While there, Bob was able to meet with his sister Vera for the last time before leaving for war. Once the pilots made it back to Selfridge Field, and the rest of the 39th, Bob took command of A Flight and readied the other pilots for the challenges that were ahead of them. Pilot Charles King remembers,
A Flight was given a fine example of Bob's flying, and we were soon flying excellent formations, which at the time may have been given more importance than it deserved. I don't think any of us had any doubts that whatever the flight was called on to do, that Bob would be able to lead, whatever the degree of difficulty involved.
Bob had confidence in everyone under his command and went to great lengths to help all of the men adapt to the challenges of the new P-39s. One such challenge involved upgrading the P-39s by hand. The 39s had to be fitted with new leak-proof tanks in the wings, and for that purpose, 600 Phillips head screws had to be removed, cataloged, and then replaced so that the wings could be opened and the new tanks installed. The nose cannons on the P-39s also had to be installed, as prior to this time, a steel bar had served as the nose cannon during air-to-air training. Unfortunately, despite these upgrades, there still remained a vast disparity between the P-39s and the Japanese Zeros they would soon encounter. Bob's A Flight made it to their new home at Bear Field near Fort Wayne, Indiana, the Saturday morning before the attack on Pearl Harbor. By the morning after, Bob was leading the first flight of the 39th Squadron out toward the west coast, right into a snowstorm. After nearly a month of jumping across the country, the 39th Squadron finally made it to Washington State. Charles King recalls,
We had hair-raising flights along the way, but Bob always got us to where we were going. Both instruments and radios were very unreliable, so Bob made maximum use of the railroad tracks for navigation purposes.
The squadron made it to Bellingham on Christmas Day, 1941. Around mid-January of 1942, Bob and the 39th traveled by train to San Francisco and from there departed by ship for the Pacific. It wasn't until halfway across the Pacific that they learned that they were on their way to Australia. After arriving in Brisbane, the squadron was shuffled around until they arrived in Williamsburg near Sydney for even more training. In late May, the 39th was sent to New Guinea to replace the squadrons from the 8th Air Group. They were now truly in the war. Initially, the Japanese Zeros sorely outmatched the P-39s, and the squadron was quickly pulled out of combat until they could be reinforced. King remembers,
I flew many of my first combat missions behind Bob, and he got us in as many scrapes as possible. He was always looking for every opportunity to meet the enemy. I don't think any of us ever had any doubts that whatever the flight was called on to do, Bob would be able to lead, whatever the degree of difficulty involved.
Come September, the 39th received their new P-38 Lightnings and began flying them immediately. Leading a bombing mission in the new P-38s against a Japanese airstrip at Lae, New Guinea, Faurot spotted a Zero trying to take off and defend the airstrip. Bob dove to intercept the Zero, but remembered that he couldn't engage the enemy with his bombs still under his wings. Faurot released his bombs and then climbed hard to avoid their blast before coming about just in time to see his bombs impact, explode, and cause the Zero that had taken off to come crashing down into the waters below. Because of his action, Bob was presented the Air Medal by General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force. Kenney joked that he wanted pilots to shoot down Zeros, not splash them with water. General Kenney presented Bob with the medal for the first downed Zero by a P-38 in air combat in the Pacific Theater of War. On March 3, 1943, during what would later be called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Bob was leading an escort flight of B-17 bombers. Before reaching their target, the flight was ambushed by about 30 Zeros, and Bob led his wing into the fray. Bob McMahon, another flight leader in the 39th, later said that he saw 2 flights of Zeros move to engage Bob Faurot directly before being targeted himself. Following the battle, 3 P-38s and 1 B-17 bomber did not return to base. Those lost in the battle included Lieutenant Hoyt A. Eason, Lieutenant Fred B. Shiflett, and Captain Robert L. Faurot. Because of their actions, the B-17 bombers were able to destroy Japanese vessels carrying nearly 3,000 Japanese troops to the Japanese position at Leh. The entire 39th was shocked and saddened by the deaths of the 3 pilots, all of whom were experienced and respected. It was especially painful to the squadron to lose Robert Faurot, the man that had led many of the pilots through their earliest combat encounters. He was respected by all and loved by those who knew him. He was truly a hero, if ever there was one. After his death, Robert's family was presented with the Silver Star, with the Oak Leaf Cluster, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, and the Purple Heart for his sacrifice. He was a great leader of men, a pilot, and a friend. He will always be remembered.